Island, the last British stronghold in New England, and proceeded with 8,000 troops for a campaign against Charleston. Outflanking the American defenders, he forced the surrender of more than 5,000 troops in May. It was the most significant American defeat of the war. Patriot resistance collapsed in the Lower South. The Southern campaign was marked by vicious fighting between partisan militias of patriots and loyalists. The violence peaked in September 1780 with Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina, where the Patriots were stronger and better organized. There the British found their southern strategy untenable, plundering towns and farms in order to feed the army in the interior had the effect of producing angry support for the Patriots. In October at Kings Mountain, Patriot sharpshooters outflanked and destroyed a Loyalist force, and in January 1781, Loyalists were again defeated at the Battle of the Cowpens, not far from Kings Mountain. Into 1781 the Continentals and Patriot militias waged what General Greene called a fugitive war of hit and run against the British. Finally, in the summer of 1781, deciding he would not be able to hold the Carolinas as long as Virginia remained a base of support and supply for the Americans, Cornwallis led his army north. After marauding through the Virginia countryside, he reached the Chesapeake where he expected reinforcements from New York. The British withdrawal from North Carolina allowed Greene to re-establish Patriot control of the Lower South. July 1, the Yorktown surrender while the British raged through the South, the stalemate continued in the Northeast. In the summer of 1780, taking advantage of the British evacuation of Rhode Island, the French landed 5,000 troops at Newport. But it was not until the spring of 1781 that Rochambeau risked joining his force to Washington's Continentals north of New York City. In August, Washington learned that the French Caribbean fleet was headed for the Chesapeake. If he and Rochambeau could move their troops south, they might lock up Cornwallis in his camp at Yorktown. Leaving a small force behind as a decoy, they marched their 16,000 men overland to the Virginia shore in little more than a month. The maneuver was a complete success. The French and Americans surrounded and besieged the British encampment. French and American heavy artillery hammered the British unmercifully until the middle of October. After the failure of a planned retreat across the York River, Cornwallis opened negotiations for the surrender of his army. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, between lines of victorious American and French soldiers, the British troops came out from their trenches to surrender. Everyone was aware that it was an event of incalculable importance, but few guessed it was the end of the war. The British still controlled New York. 7.2 The United States in Congress assembled what kind of government was created by the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, the first written constitution of the United States, created a national government of sharply limited powers. This arrangement reflected the concerns of people fighting to free themselves from a coercive central government. But the weak Confederation government had a difficult time forging the unity and assembling the resources necessary to fight the war and win the peace. 7.2.1 The Articles of Confederation. The debate over Confederation that took place in the Continental Congress during 1776 made it clear that delegates favoring a loose union of autonomous states outnumbered those who wanted a strong central government. A consensus finally emerged in 1777, and the Articles of Confederation were formally adopted by the Continental Congress in November and sent to the states for ratification. The Articles created a National Assembly, called the Congress, in which each state had a single vote. Delegates, selected annually in a manner determined by the individual state legislatures, could serve no more than 3 years out of 6. A presiding president, elected annually by Congress, was eligible to hold office no more than 1 year out of 3. Votes would be decided by a simple majority of the states, except for major questions, which would require the agreement of 9 states. Congress was granted national authority in the conduct of foreign affairs, matters of war and peace, and maintenance of the armed forces. It could raise loans, issue bills of credit, establish a coinage, and regulate trade with Indian peoples, and it was to be the final authority in jurisdictional disputes between states. Lacking the power to tax citizens directly, however, the national government was to apportion its financial burdens among the states according to the extent of their surveyed land. The Articles explicitly guaranteed the sovereignty of the individual states, reserving to them all powers not expressly delegated to Congress. The Articles of Confederation thus created a national government of specific yet sharply circumscribed powers. The legislatures of 12 states soon voted in favor of the articles, but final ratification was held up for more than 3 years by the state of Maryland. Representing the interests of states without claims to lands west of the Appalachians, Maryland demanded that states cede to Congress their western claims, the new nation's most valuable resource, for the good of the whole. During the subsequent stalemate, Congress agreed to conduct business under the terms of the unratified document. It was 1781 before Virginia, the state with the largest western claims, broke the logjam by agreeing to the cession. Maryland then ratified the Articles of Confederation, and in March they took effect. 7.2.2 Financing the war. Lacking the authority to levy direct taxes, Congress financed the Revolution through grants and loans from friendly foreign powers and by issuing paper currency. The total foreign subsidy by the end of the war approached $9 million, but this was not enough to back the circulating continental currency that Congress authorized, the face value of which amounted to $200 million. In an attempt to retire this currency, Congress called on the states to raise taxes, payable in continental dollars. But most of the states were unwilling to do this. In fact, most had resorted to printing currency of their own, estimated at a face value of another $200 million by war's end. The result of this expansion in the money supply was the rapid depreciation of continental currency. By the time Robert Morris, one of the wealthiest merchants in the country, became Secretary of Finance in May 1781, continental currency had ceased to circulate. Morris was able to turn things around. He persuaded Congress to charter a Bank of North America, located in Philadelphia, the first private commercial bank in the United States. Into its vaults he deposited large quantities of gold and silver coin and bills of exchange obtained through loans from Holland and France. He then issued new paper currency. Backed by this treasure. Once he established confidence in the bank, Morris was able to supply the Continental Army through private contracts. He also began making interest payments on the debt, which in 1783 was estimated at $30 million. 7.2.3 Negotiating independence peace talks between the United States and Great Britain opened in July 1782 when Benjamin Franklin sat down with the British emissary in Paris. The fundamental demand was recognition of American independence and withdrawal of British forces. American negotiators were instructed to press for the largest territorial limits possible, as well as guarantees of American rights to fish North Atlantic waters. As for its French ally, Congress instructed the commissioners to be guided by friendly advice, but also by knowledge of our interests, and by your own discretion, in which we repose the fullest confidence. The French were not happy with this, and partly as a result of French pressure, in June 1781 Congress issued a new set of instructions. The commissioners were to settle merely for a grant of independence and withdrawal of troops and to be subject to the guidance and control of the French in the negotiations. Ben Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams, the peace commissioners in Paris, were well aware of French attempts to manipulate the outcome of negotiations and place limits on American power. In violation of both congressional instructions and treaty obligations to France, they signed a preliminary treaty with Britain in November 1782 without consulting the French. In the treaty, Britain acknowledged the United States as free, sovereign, and independent, and agreed to withdraw its troops from all forts within American territory, with all convenient speed. The American commissioners pressed the British for Canada but settled for Western territorial boundaries extending to the Mississippi with unencumbered navigation of the river. The preliminary treaty confronted France with an accomplished fact. When French diplomats criticized the American commissioners, they responded by hinting that resistance to the treaty provisions could result in a British-American alliance. Thereupon France quickly made an agreement of its own with the British. Spain did not participate in the negotiations with the Americans. But having waged a successful campaign against the British on the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast, its government issued a claim of sovereignty over much of the Trans-Appalachian territory granted to the United States by Great Britain. Spain arranged a separate peace with Great Britain, in which it won the return of Florida. The final Treaty of Paris, actually a series of separate agreements among the United States, Great Britain, France, and Spain, was signed at Versailles on September 3, 1783. 7.2.4 The Crisis of Demobilization. In 1778 Continental officers had won from Congress a promise of life pensions at half pay in exchange for enlistment for the duration of the war. By 1783, however, Congress had still not made any specific provisions for officers' pensions. With peace at hand, the officers began to fear that the army would be disbanded before the problem was resolved, and they would lose whatever power they had to pressure Congress. In January 1783, a group of prominent senior officers petitioned Congress, demanding that pensions be converted to a bonus equal to 5 years of full pay. Despite the barely veiled threat of military intervention, Congress rejected their petition. With the backing of congressional nationalists, a group of Army officers associated with General Horatio Gates circulated a letter arguing for direct military intervention and calling an extraordinary meeting of the officer corps at Newburgh. But General Washington, on whom the officers counted for support, criticized the meeting as disorderly and called an official meeting of his own. There was enormous tension as the officers assembled on March 15, 1783. Washington strode into the room and mounted the platform. Turning his back in disdain on Gates, he delivered an address from memory condemning the circular letter. After he left, the officers adopted resolutions rejecting intervention, and a week later, on Washington's urging, Congress converted the promised pensions to bonuses. Washington's role in this crisis was one of his greatest contributions to the nation. At stake was nothing less than the possibility of a military coup at the very moment of victory. The American Revolution was the first of many successful colonial revolutions, and in hindsight it is clear that post-independence military rule was a common outcome in many of them. In December 1783, Washington resigned his commission as General of the Army despite calls for him to remain. There is little doubt he could have assumed the role of an American dictator. Instead, by his actions and example, the principle of military subordination to civil authority was firmly established. As for the common soldiers, they wanted simply to be discharged. In May 1783, Congress voted the soldiers 3 months' pay as a bonus and instructed Washington to begin dismissing them. By the beginning of 1784, the Continental Army had shrunk to no more than a few hundred men. 7.2.5 The problem of the West. Even during the Revolution, thousands of Americans migrated westward, and after the war settlers poured over the mountains and down the Ohio River. Thousands of Americans pressed against the Indian country north of the Ohio River, and destructive violence continued. Along the frontier, British troops continued to occupy posts in the Great Lakes region and encouraged Indian attacks on vulnerable settlements. Spain refused to accept the territorial settlement of the Treaty of Paris and closed the port of New Orleans to Americans, effectively blockading the Mississippi River. Westerners who saw that route as their primary access to markets were outraged. John Jay, appointed Secretary for Foreign Affairs by the Confederation Congress in 1784, attempted to negotiate with the British for their complete withdrawal but was told that was not possible until all outstanding debts from before the war were settled. Jay also negotiated with the Spanish for guarantees of territorial sovereignty and commercial relations, but they insisted that the Americans relinquish free navigation of the Mississippi. Congress would approve no treaty under those conditions, and some frustrated Westerners considered leaving the Confederation. In the West, local community interest continued to override the fragile development of national community sentiment. In 1784, Congress took up the problem of extending national authority over the West. Legislation was drafted, principally by Thomas Jefferson, providing government for the Western Territory. The legislation proposed a remarkably Republican colonial policy. The Western public domain would be divided into states, fully the equals of the original 13, with congressional guarantees of self-government and Republican institutions. Once the population of a territory numbered 20,000, the residents could call a convention and establish a constitution and government of their own choosing. And once the population grew to equal that of the smallest of the original 13 states, the territory could petition for statehood, provided it agreed to remain forever a member of the Confederation. Congress accepted these proposals but rejected by a vote of 7-6 Jefferson's clause forever prohibiting slavery in the West. Passed the following year, the Land Ordinance of 1785 provided for the survey and sale of Western lands. The settlement of Kentucky had been characterized by a chaos of overlapping surveys and land claims, a problem the Land Ordinance was designed to solve by creating an ordered system of survey, dividing the land into townships composed of 36 sections of 1 square mile each. Jefferson argued that land ought to be given away to actual settlers. But, eager to establish a revenue base for the government, Congress provided for the auction of public lands for not less than $1 per acre. In the treaties of Fort Stanwix in 1784 and Fort McIntosh in 1785, congressional commissioners forced the Iroquois and a number of Ohio tribes, respectively, to cede portions of their territory in what is now eastern Ohio. These treaties were not the result of negotiation but intimidation. The commissioners dictated the terms by seizing hostages and forcing compliance. Surveyors were immediately sent west to divide up the land. The first surveyed lands did not come onto the market until the fall of 1788, and in the meantime Congress, desperate for revenue, sold a tract of more than 1.5 million acres to the Ohio Company, a new consortium of land speculators, for $1 million. Thousands of Westerners chose not to wait for the official opening of the public lands north of the Ohio River but simply settled illegally by making squatters' claims. In 1785 Congress raised troops and evicted many of them, but once the troops departed the squatters returned. The persistence of this problem convinced many congressmen to revise Jefferson's Democratic Territorial Plan. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Congress established a system of government for the territory north of the Ohio. 3 to 5 states were to be carved from the giant Northwest Territory. Slavery was prohibited. But the initial guarantee of self-government in Jefferson's plan was replaced by a congressionally appointed governor and court of judges. Once the free white male population of the territory had grown to 5,000, these citizens would be permitted to choose an assembly, but the governor had the power of absolute veto on all territorial legislation. National interest would be imposed on the local Western communities. The creation of the land system of the United States was the major achievement of the Confederation government. But there were other important accomplishments. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress led the country through the Revolution and its commissioners negotiated the terms of a comprehensive peace treaty. And by organizing the departments of War, Foreign Affairs, Finance, and the Post Office, the Confederation government created the beginnings of a national bureaucracy. 7.3 Revolutionary politics in the states. In what ways were the states the sites for significant political change? Despite the accomplishments of the Confederation, most Americans were focused on the governments of their own states. The national government was distant and had relatively little effect on people's lives. Social and political identity was located in local communities and states rather than the American nation. The states were the setting for the most important political struggles of the Confederation period. 7.3.1 A new democratic ideology. The political mobilization that took place in 1774 and 1775 greatly broadened political participation. Mass meetings in which ordinary people expressed their opinions, voted, and gained political experience were common not only in the cities but in small towns and rural communities as well.